Send your Spirit, O God, to illumine our hearts and minds, that we might be drawn more deeply into your presence this day. We ask this through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Well, it's good to be with you all this morning. Some of you were here last week. Some of you weren't here last week. One thing that I don't know if I mentioned, these chapters in the book Being Disciples can really stand on their own. They're topically driven, so while there is a sense of continuity, the entire book is about sort of different dimensions and registers of what it means to be a disciple. If you miss a week, or if you don't read one of the chapters assigned for that week, feel free to join in as you're able. Feel free to come even if you don't read, because hopefully the recap at the beginning of the session and then the conversation will hopefully be accessible enough to you that you will be able to participate. And if you miss a week, if you're out of town or for whatever reason, feel free to come back. Don't feel as if I missed last week and so I'm so far behind and I have to read last week before I can come to this week. That's not necessarily the case. Please know that you are welcome even if you didn't come the previous week. So we are on week 2. Last week we did a little bit of an orientation and introduction. So first a little recap of what we did last Sunday. We talked a little bit about Rowan Williams last Sunday, the author. We talked a little bit about this book, Being Disciples, my first impressions of it. We talked a little bit about the structure and the schedule of the readings. And if you have questions about that, if you missed last week, feel free. I'm happy to ask. I'm happy to fill you in on that. And then we talked a little bit about discipleship itself. That was the bulk of our time together. And we reflected at tables with one another about what strikes us when we think about what it means to be a disciple. And then we had a passage from the Gospel of John, chapter 1, which Rowan Williams actually quotes at the beginning of his chapter 1 in his book. And we thought together about what it might mean to be a disciple with that scriptural passage in view. So today we're going to think about these first 2 chapters in our book. And though they bear down on one another, what we're going to do this morning is I'll give a little brief introduction to chapter 1, and then we have a few questions to talk about. And then I'll do a little brief introduction to chapter 2, and then we'll have a little bit of time for conversation. So, chapter 1. Chapter 1 is entitled Being Disciples. And this chapter, I think, really lays some important groundwork for what Rowan Williams is up to. And there's so much in this chapter. When I first read this chapter, I thought, if the other chapters are half as good or half as interesting and engaging as this, I'm happy to buy this book 10 times over. It's a really engaging chapter, and it raises some really interesting questions. But I want to hold a couple things up to you before we have some time for conversation. So the first thing that Williams says, and he says this repeatedly throughout the book and in different ways, is that being a disciple is what he calls a state of being. Now this is kind of a scholarly or academic way of saying that being a disciple has to do with your entire life. It's a way of living. So not just what we happen to choose on any given day, but the ways in which we describe how we go about our days, the how of our living. And part of learning a way of life, he makes the case, is to be immersed in it. And this is what he says is an ancient notion of what it means to be a student, which we're talking about discipleship, what it means to be a student, one who learns. A student in ancient times was a little bit different, he says, from what it means to be a student now. A student in antiquity would follow the teacher around, would even sleep outside their door in order to glean wisdom, to soak it up, whether by osmosis or by actually hearing or engaging with the teacher. So he says this. This is the quote on the slide. In other words, what makes you a disciple is not turning up from time to time. Discipleship may literally mean being a student in the strict Greek sense of the word. But it doesn't mean turning up once a week for a course or even a sermon. It's not an intermittent state. It's a relationship that continues. The truth is that in the ancient world, being a student was rather more like that than it is these days. To be the student of a teacher was to commit yourself to living the same atmosphere and breathing the same air. There was nothing intermittent about it. So I think this is a stark claim if we really let it sink in. And it works against much of what is within me. And maybe you feel that too. It's nice to have faith to ornament our lives rather than dictate or dominate. Williams makes a case that though being a student necessarily means lingering, that being a student necessarily means lingering, abiding, being where the teacher is. And he uses this powerful image of bird watching on pages 4 and 5. I won't read that, but to sum it up, the bird watcher goes to the place that the bird watcher thinks they will see the bird. And they sit patiently in expectation that something will happen. There's an awareness to what it means to be a bird watcher. There's an awareness to what it means to be a disciple. So you have expectancy and awareness and patience. All of these things undergird what it means to be a disciple, what it means to follow Jesus. So as those who follow Jesus, we are to go where Jesus is. This seems like a simple enough claim, but Williams draws it out in two distinct ways. The first, being with Jesus, following Jesus, means being in the company of those with whom Jesus seeks and keeps company. This seems relatively straightforward. To seek and serve the lost, those who are outcast on the margins of society, so on and so forth. The second register of what it means to follow Jesus is something more mysterious and something much deeper. Being with Jesus means being in the company of Jesus, in the presence of God the Father. And here's the quote on the slide. We are to be where he is, not only in terms of mission and outreach and service in the world, in serving and accompanying the outcast. We are also to be where he is in his closeness to the Father. We follow him, Jesus, not simply to the ends of the earth to do his work and echo his service. We follow him to be next to the heart of the Father. Williams draws out this point with passages from the Gospel of John. The same stuff that we are called to do as disciples. To see, to listen, to pray, so on and so forth. These are the same sorts of things we see Jesus doing in the Gospels in relationship to God the Father. So just as our relationship with Jesus is sustained, so too is Jesus' relationship with the Father sustained. It's eternal and it's unbroken. Now, I'll be honest with you and say that while this is incredibly powerful and beautiful to me, it is perhaps the most challenging thing for me to get my mind around. I can get on board and I can sort of wrap my head around going and seeking and serving the people Jesus sought and served. To be with those who are in various sorts of need. But when we take the metaphysical step, when we take the deeper, the more mysterious step, that we are caught up in the relationship of God, in God's very being, in the communion of the triune God of love by virtue of being connected with Jesus, that takes a little bit more from me. It's a little bit more challenging. Williams names this as the contemplative mode of what it means to be a disciple. Remember in the first chapter or last week, we talked a little bit about being a disciple for Williams means something both in the active sense that we're doing things that disciples do, but it also means something in a contemplative or in a deeper sense, and this is that contemplative sense. So here we see that active and contemplative dynamic. Being a disciple as following after Jesus to the margins, being a disciple as resting, as lingering with God in some sort of mystic communion. So, we are going to have a little bit of time to think about these ideas. So, our question. So the first question, we have two questions for this chapter. So our first question, what do you make of Williams' claim that being a disciple is a way of life? What are the challenges you see in this? Second question is, what do you make of Williams' argument that following Jesus is both missional / outreach and mystical / communal God? Do you tend to favor one of these over the other? All right, so now we're going to have an opportunity to hear what you'd like to share. So if we could go around, I'm just curious what each table reflected upon. You can either choose to reflect on question 1 or question 2. So over here to my left, y'all have anything you'd like to share with the group?
We see the missional outreach and the mystical communion as being bound together. Just as I think the author does, he sees it that way. And if you're truly faithful and committed, well then everything you do relates back to that faithful commitment. And it isn't like, well, you come to church and you're a disciple on Sunday, and then you go out in the world and you put on a secular hat and you act in a different way. In other words, the morality that you develop through your mystical or contemplative state should translate into everything you do.
Did everyone hear that? So Alan kind of tied the two questions together, saying that their group talked about how the missional outreach and the mystical communal aspects of discipleship sort of complement one another, and that the mystical communal aspect can help to inform the ways in which they go about serving in the world, and also recognizing that that discipleship as a way of living has to do with faith and commitment, not simply putting on a church hat, taking it off when you leave, putting on a secular hat, non-church hat, and wearing that about the world. Is that fair? What about table 2 here? How many think that? The world gets in the way.
Drew, could we ask people that when they're taught to take their masks off
Sure.
and to project?
Yeah, and I'll do what I can to sort of
Okay.
reiterate the comments.
So you can have a way of life, and you can go on retreats, or else another way you can go to the monastery and go and I'm going to deal with this last half of it, and therefore you don't interact with people because you're trying to get away from that world. But everything that God said,
So John said that it's really it can be easy to focus on what it means to be a disciple, and then get on the interstate and have that completely derailed. That must be a problem that you have alone, not any of us. No, I'm just kidding. But I mean, the issue of distraction, of having our attention diverted, is certainly a very real thing. And I think, that hit home with me when I was reading about having a sense of awareness or expectancy, patience. I mean, all of these things in my life are in short supply. So it's easy for me to sort of be taken one way or the other.
One of the things that we brought up here is that basically, if you're following along with Williams's argument about discipleship, that it's sort of being all in, not just one foot in, one foot out. Like we come here on Sunday and we get that communal, mystical, connection, and our connection with people who by and large look like us, have the same socioeconomic status, blah, 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 whatever. And that is that outreach part that is missing, even in just our daily lives, like offering compassion to a coworker, or having, seeing a need and trying to fill that for a neighbor or something like that. And I just told an anecdotal story about last night. I had dinner at a neighbor's house, and they had gone to Slidell, close to Slidell. Her mom is 89 years old, lives by herself, and is independent. They've had a bunch of trees come down. And they're part of, mom at least, is part of the Southern Baptist church. And the Southern Baptist Disaster Recovery Team just appeared in the driveway, and basically was very organized, very efficient, they're insured, they're a corporation, the whole 9 yards, and basically cleared the trees so she could get out of her yard. And my neighbors were blown away because, and one of the things I said to them, I said, well, that's not a reason to join a church, I don't know what is. Because all they asked was just, can we pray with you afterwards? And if they just said no, they would just left. It wouldn't have been a big deal.
Yeah.
But just an amazing thing about being committed and being all in and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Just, so that's.
Yeah, that's great. Anyone from this table? Do you have anything you'd like to share?
You said she thought what they thought.
You thought what they thought? Okay.
What they said. Good job, David.
All right.
Oh, wait, I
Okay.
think a couple of things that were said were, I think most of us agreed that the active part for us was easier and maybe more part of our daily lives. But that the mystical communal part, we had to kind of get reminders of, and one of our tables said possibly like looking, maybe every time you look at your watch or when you're at a red light, to use that as an opportunity to reconnect in a more mystical communal way, and just to have those reminders throughout the day, so that when we get on the interstate, we don't do what we might want to do.
Thank you. All right, our last table.
Can you hear me without the microphone? I'm not projecting.
I can reiterate.
I'll stand up and
Okay.
project.
Okay.
Because I'm going to relate it to what Minnie just said. It was something I told our table. On the way
All right. So Anne has a formula for getting every green light on the way here, is what she's saying. And for a single installment of $9.99, you can. Well, thank you all. Some really good thoughts here, and we're gonna charge ahead to chapter 2, faith, hope, and love. 3 easy things to wrap our minds around. Faith, hope, and love. This chapter packs a lot into 15 pages. A lot into 15 pages. There's a lot to talk about here. And so I'm going to kind of give a brief overview of my sort of takeaways, and then I'll hand it over to you for time of conversation. Faith, hope, and love are considered and have been considered really since the beginnings of the church the hallmark theological virtues, the things that disciples of Jesus are to embody. Faith, hope, and love. And this is taken from the writings of St. Paul in 1 Corinthians 13. Faith, hope, and love abide. In that beautiful elegy to love. William's approach here to these 3 virtues is really interesting. And he takes each one of these in turn. There's a section on each of them throughout the chapter. And he borrows from the 16th century Spanish theologian St. John of the Cross, which you may or may not be familiar with his writing. But what he does is he pairs faith, hope, and love with the threefold picture of the human mind that John of the Cross put forth in his writing. So the mind, St. John of the Cross said, understands, the mind remembers, and the mind wants or desires. And so Williams attaches faith, hope, and love to each of these 3. So faith to understanding, hope to remembering, and love to wanting or desiring. What he says is this paints a perfect picture of where we start and where we finish. So that's kind of something to keep in the back of your mind as you're looking back through this chapter. Faith, hope, and love, understanding, remembering, and wanting. Perfect picture of where we start and finish. And this is that bigger quote right there at the bottom. In the Christian life, faith is what happens to our understanding, hope is what happens to our remembering, and love is what happens to our wanting. So to grow as a disciple is to take the journey from understanding into faith, from memory into hope, and from will into love. I think this can be a little bit theoretical or esoteric, and so we're kind of going to take each one in turn and tease it apart a little bit, see what we can do. So, understanding and faith. So Williams makes the case, and I won't go into too much detail here, that our approach to knowledge today is robustly functional. We don't quite know what knowing is for, he says. And we don't even know that we can know or what we can know. There's all sorts of questions that come forth from a claim like this, of course, especially as it pertains to things of faith, things of religion, belief, so on and so forth. Such an understanding of what it means to know, he makes the argument, betrays a mistrust, that we are distrustful of the things and the people that are around us. He writes this, but in among all this is also a problem of a loss of confidence in reason in our contemporary world. By that I don't mean a loss of confidence in rational procedures so much as a loss of patience with argument, real mutual persuasion, a loss of the idea that by mutual persuasion and careful argument we might have our minds enlarged to receive more of the truth. We are at a difficult time, he says. And Williams, with St. John of the Cross, diagnoses this, and that there's this loss of trust as it pertains to knowledge, to knowing. There's a patience here that is also lost as well. So this kind of harkens back to our previous chapter, where being a disciple means being aware, being patient, being expectant, so on and so forth. So faith comes and emerges in William's mind as a dependable relationship. So if knowing today, if knowledge today has a problem with trust, faith comes in and offers what he says is a dependable relationship. Something dependable, something we can trust. So I'm going to stop there with faith. And you can talk more about this at your table in a moment. So, faith as a dependable relationship, he writes, is something other than faith as a system of propositions, or faith as confidence in my own capacity to master truth. It's much more a confidence that I am to be mastered by truth, that I can be held even when I don't feel I can hold on. If my relation with the living truth is initiated and sustained by God's faithfulness, not mine, it is dependable. But recognizing that requires me to step back from confidence in my own resources.
What does that mean?
So you're going to have the opportunity to talk about what that means. Isn't that what Jesus did, right? He turned the questions back on himself. Who do you say? Okay, so second, memory and hope. Williams argues that if the question of knowing and understanding is what is truth, then the question of what is hope is, have we forgotten who we are? Or who we were? It's the question of social amnesia, one way to put it. To this, he holds out that hope, and this is from the slide, is not just a confidence that there is a future for us. It's also a confidence that there is a continuity, such that the future is related to the same truth and living reality as the past and the present. Hope, like faith, is hope in relation. Relation to that which does not go away and abandon. Relation to a reality that knows and sees and holds who we are and have been. You have an identity because you have a witness to who you are. Now again, there is a lot here, and you'll have time to talk about what this means. But one thing to mention here is that his understanding, William's understanding of hope greatly resembles that of faith. Just as faith is faith in a dependable relationship, so too hope is hope within the context of a dependable relationship. A relationship to that which does not fade, does not go away. Relationship to a reality that knows and sees and holds who we are and who we have been. Here's another quote. This one is not on the PowerPoint. Hope, then, is not simply a confidence in the future. It is a confidence that the past, present, and future are held together in one relationship, so that the confusions about memory, who we were, who was I, who am I, and who are we, become bearable because of the witness in heaven, a witness who does not abandon. So again, you'll have a moment to talk more at your tables about memory and hope. And third and finally, want and love, or desire and love. So Williams, in the first part of this section, takes to task the pretty commonplace idea that freedom is some sort of unfettered access to whatever option we choose. This is what he calls supermarket shelf choice. The problem with this is that it presents us as individuals with a disconnected understanding of ourselves and a stunted view of what it means to be truly free. In this understanding, the supermarket shelf choice understanding, freedom is simply the freedom to exercise choice. We are creatures who somewhat haphazardly choose this or that from an infinite array of options. And such freedom, Williams makes the case, loses touch with the deep desires that make us who we are. Here's the quote that's up there for you. The most important freedom is the freedom to be ourselves, the freedom to grow. Not to be ourselves in the sense of asserting what we want moment by moment, but to discover slowly and patiently the deepest rhythms of our life, and to find the context in which we grow as God means us to. So love is an openness to the dependable presence of God. And again, you can see, hopefully, the relational side of this. The dependable presence that doesn't go away, he writes, the presence that remembers and holds us in a single gaze, what has been true and is true of us, the eternal, unshakable witness to what we are. That presence is love. We are seen, known, and held, but above all, we are welcomed. We are the objects of eternal delight. Now, some of this reflection feels a little heady. It feels a little esoteric, feels a little bit scholarly. And it might seem a bit far afield from where we began this morning in our talk of being disciples. But William asserts, he makes the point over and over that these three virtues, faith, hope, and love, are at the heart of what it means to be a disciple. So as we think about them, he says, we are contemplating what it means to be a disciple. We rediscover them, he writes, as we discover that relationship which makes us whole. That relationship with the unconditional presence and witness, absolution and affirmation that belong to God. We discover all this, in short, in relation to the God of the Gospels, the God of Jesus, the God Jesus is. So hopefully you see at the heart of this that there is this relational understanding. There's a relational understanding as it pertains to each faith, hope, and love. So you'll have time to reflect upon this. Our first question for you to discuss at your tables is to think together about William's understanding of faith. What do you like? What could be left out? So this is on pages 22 through 27 primarily. So I would start there. So think together about this understanding of faith. The second question is, what do you make of the idea that hope is not just an optimism about the future? This is on pages 29 through 31.